Great. Well, it's great to be here, of course. At CIA, we have such a deep commitment in the creation and our partnership with the Torbera Mediterranean Center of this amazing conference that now has so many years of iteration and so many more to come. So this panel, as was mentioned, does move us in a little bit of a different direction. Looking back, looking forward, cultural exchange and evolution around the Mediterranean kitchen. What the Mediterranean eye does and should constitute in today's food and cultural landscape is an increasingly well-articulated domain, as we have been hearing, contributed to in many areas, but also through the applied scholarship that we've heard now in many editions of the Tomorrow Tastes Mediterranean Conference. This particular panel, however, attempts to bridge present developments with the past, illustrating the evolution around the Mediterranean kitchen and its seminal contributions. A few central questions that will be explored by the panelists today include: how do we understand both the realized and intangible heritage of the Mediterranean diet with its current global interest and reach in the historical context of its cultural, nutritional, archaeological, and agricultural legacies? In our present context, how much does the Mediterranean diet represent a distinct, practiced dietary pattern and/or an aspiration that informs a wide array of dietary choices and preferences? And does its greatest value lie in specific recipes and preparation techniques, food sourcing and nutritional guidance, or in a sensibility that more generally influences people's approach to food products, cultural customs, and eating? We have 4 distinguished panelists to share their insights on these questions and many more questions, to be followed by some general discussion amongst them and with all of you. So let's jump right in. The first comments will come from Noga Arica, who is senior expert at the Florence School of Transnational Governance, not translational, transnational governance, at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. I'll also say I'm not going to give you long bios for each of the presenters. Rather than taking up time for that, you have that link in your programs, and they can share some highlights from their bios that may be relevant. But let's begin with Noga.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you to all the organizers for this and for including me. I am a bit of an outsider from this field, as I'm a philosopher, historian of ideas, a bit of the long interest in food and food history. Is there the way to get the slides? Oh, thank you. So I want to start with a bit of a provocation. It works. The local and the age of the global. I want to start with this because we have to think that the Mediterranean, of course, we have to ask what it is exactly we're talking about. Where does it begin? When does it begin? Historically, geographically, culturally, economically. I think this is going to be discussed, of course, with the archaeologists here. There's a historical reality that does overlap also with a kind of branding that is much more modern and contemporary. In this regard, I want to ask, what is exactly tradition when we're talking about tradition? Isn't it invented at some level? What is invention of tradition? I'll go back to that in a minute. Just the quick map of ancient Mediterranean, at least one moment of it. When you see, of course, the exchanges of cultures, we're talking about exchanges of cultures and languages. As Claudia Roden, the wonderful, whom I suppose many of you know, the wonderful writer and historian of food and of great cookbooks, one of her recent ones, Med, which talks about the great variety of Mediterranean cuisine, which you can see reflected in the map just before here. Sorry, oops, I wanted to go before. There we go. The Mediterranean cuisine, of course, is not exactly one thing, and I will go back to this in a minute as well. We're talking about extreme variety of cultures, of religions, of course, geographies. There is a constant, we agree with this, olive oil perhaps would be, as we said, as was seen before, the kind of binding element, but there are many, many there's a great variety to what we're talking about here, and I think this is something we need to bear in mind. I'm presenting you with a bit of text which you can look at for yourselves or take pictures of it. I'm not going to obviously read aloud what is written here, just a point of departure. I want to also provoke a little bit about the idea of origins, the idea of that goes together also the idea of tradition, which needs to be parsed a little bit, maybe even philosophically. There's a wonderful recent book by the great Italian food historian Massimo Montanari, whose recent book by the history, little story of spaghetti al pomodoro, which we associate with Italy and this typical Italian food, also branded more recently, and he kind of, again, parses, historically analyzes the origin both of pasta, the history of pasta in Italy, and of course, well, we know, obviously, tomatoes are much more recent accretion. But he talks about this, I think, very interesting idea that beware the idolatry of origins and of original traditions, because there is no such thing really as a recipe made of one thing or a tradition made of one thing. There's always been travels between, of course, as also was observed just before, there's always been exchanges of ingredients. They've always traveled, even in, of course, also in antiquity, to a great deal, just as there always has been the valuation of local ingredients. You see, for example, Bartolomeo Sacchi, the Renaissance humanist who wrote one of the great cookbooks of the Renaissance, the Onesta Voluptate e Valutudine, talking about the great carrots of Viterbo, the hens of Padova, and much more. But still, as Montanari says, a recipe is made of mixes, dynamic mixes. And there is no recipe, no dish, no proper eating of products aren't combined. A tradition can't be from one place. And the provenance of it, the territorial greatness, the DOP we were talking about before, only makes sense because products circulate. Otherwise, you wouldn't need it. That's something we need to bear in mind as well. Thank you. Have you been hearing me so far? Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. So just another map. We love maps. I mean, I love maps. A historical map of the Mediterranean, just to always remember where we are. I talked about inventing traditions. That's something that there's a essay, a famous book edited by the Marxist historian, late historian Eric Hobsbawm, Inventing Traditions. And what is exactly a tradition? He talks about the values and norms of behavior by repetition, which automatically implies a continuity with the past. Thus, continuity is also constructed. He talks about this contrast between the constant change and innovation of the modern world and the attempt to structure at least some part of social life within it as unchanging and invariant. So this is something that we need to also think about. There's a fabrication, a cultural need as well that changes according to time, to the centuries, and to the cultural, economic, social moment. It's something we need, again, I'm saying this as a provocation. Again, think of tomato as so crucial, so central to Mediterranean diet, which of course did not exist in Europe before the 16th century. Let's remember this. The history is important, it matters, we'll see that more in this panel. So local traditions are kind of product of material context, agricultural conditions, and so on, but they overlap now, certainly. The cultural continuity we're talking about overlaps with what was talking about before with Stefano Sotiu, the loss of knowledge of seasonal varietals, of species diversity, industrialization of food, which overtook local agricultural conditions in modernity, mass global distribution, and so on and so forth, the mass iteration of ingredients shaped for longevity. He was just addressing this before, and I think this is really important to remember this when we're talking about the Mediterranean diet, because what is it we're eating exactly? You know, the loss of a variety of seeds and so on and so forth, diverse from seasonal, even knowledge of what is in season when, that's something that we need to think about. Obviously, local doesn't mean everything, as also was picked up before. International trade has always existed. That's something, again, we need to think about. Culinary borders are artificial. So Mediterranean is a geographical entity, wide climactic cultural variations, an amalgam, a construct. I think this is, again, something we need to maybe remind ourselves of. At the same time, it is suggestive of something that is real, what we're talking about. I mean, this idea of the citrus, the olive, the fig, milk and honey, the fertile, lush lands, this is true. We want to preserve it. We want to cultivate it. So there is this virtuously local, non-globalized industrial fare is what we are after, what we want to preserve for the sake of today and for tomorrow. Just this is actually a market in Fethiye, in southern Turkey, a couple of summers ago when I was there. I just wanted to give this an example. This is Turkey, the Mediterranean diet, very present there, not European, and obviously very much part of what we're talking about. Something that was addressed before, and this is relevant to what we're talking about as well, the globalization of the Mediterranean diet, which became a brand in 1775. Mediterranean diet is an American term. We talked about this in the first panel. It was exported, really accelerating, by Elizabeth David in the 50s to the UK when you couldn't even find garlic properly. Alice Waters, famously, Chez Panisse in San Francisco, the farm-to-table movement, the locavore movement. That's kind of more of an Anglo-American movement, so which tends to recuperate what was lost in global capitalism. Do I have an extra minute? I need an extra minute. And I think we talk about the local, it corresponds to this longing of the uprooted for roots, in the sense of the global for the local, very typical of really what, in a sense, is what the well-heeled urbanites and global big cities want the local farm-to-table food, which is indeed costly, as was pointed out before. And it really shouldn't be. It should be the local market, the local produce, with, of course, the traditionally circulating ones like olive oil and so on, should remain affordable. So again, the history matters. Historically, the upper classes in France, Italy, and so on were often eating too much by our standards, not very well. Lower classes ate healthily, but tendently not enough. They had rough lives. It's not as if this was all nice and wonderful and lovely. Agricultural life was hard, and often it was rejected in modernity. As we also know, a lot of territory was destroyed because of that as well. So it's a kind of double fabrication, the idea of local tradition. It can ignore the variability, the cultural diversity, the exchanges, the military conquest, and so on, the circulation of foodstuffs, borrowing and changing of recipes, climate vagaries, as well as inventing an attachment to a kind of fantasized past, while the truly rooted might actually want to sell out to the tourism industry, the tourists who come from other places to consume the local, the typical local, the stereotypical local. We have to be careful of this. So I think as we sort of make these distinctions, I'm going to add this rather funny slide, because this is the myth of the local, what doesn't really mean necessarily healthy tradition historically. So, just as now the idea that, Anglo-American dominance of fast food, of bad food, is on the wane, we know that sustainable practices need to be absolutely cultivated. We accept that. We need to make more efforts for this to be the case. We need to use the new technologies of agriculture for the sake of sustainability. But I think this is the time precisely to unite the efforts within the Mediterranean region to help prosperity and peace across regions that, as we know, are not always in peace with each other, exchanging recipes and cultures for the sake of, until, to be united by the olive tree in all its senses. That's my...
It's difficult to calculate the vast number of newlyweds households that were spared the large expense of hiring cooks, but foremost saved from divorce. In this way, one journalist described the importance of Nikos Tselemides's Cooking and Baking Guide from 1926, which is so foundational to Greek cuisine of the 20th century that its very name became synonymous with cookbook. Doubtless we'll hear more about Tselemides tomorrow in our first plenary session of the morning. Tselemides created a style of cooking that embraced Western European fashions while applying them in a Greek context, so successfully that his recipes captured the attention not only of Greek housewives, but also of restaurateurs in Greece and abroad. His dishes today are so emblematic of the Greek kitchen that many will be shocked to learn that they are hardly traditional in the form in which we've enjoyed them for our entire lives, rather only a century old. Such dishes include moussaka, pasticcio, and artichokes alla polita. Bechamel and bouillabaisse were novelties that he introduced. Tsalemundes's goal was to, quote, introduce European society, customs, manners, and tastes to every Greek home. And I would add, to purify and unify Greek cuisine for the middle and upper classes, a culinary parallel to the linguistic purification of the language that resulted in a reversion to the form of Greek that we call katharevousa, that is, purified speech. He was unbothered by the fact that his own recipes were hardly those of Greek antiquity, since he was convinced that French cuisine had itself origins in classical Greek. The reality is, of course, that the Greek diet, like the foodways of other regions of the Mediterranean, have not been invariably stable through time. The 1950s concept of the Mediterranean diet not only described the Greek diet at a particular point in time, in the aftermath of the political turmoil that followed World War II, but also the diet of a particular contemporary social stratum. In the remainder of my brief presentation, I will turn to an earlier alteration in elite diet that occurred right here in Messenia, a revolution influenced not by France, but by the most influential center of the 15th century before Christ, Minoan Crete, and likely the palace of Knossos itself, the greatest power of that day. The target was the so-called Palace of Nestor, the best preserved of all the Bronze Age palaces on the Greek mainland. Only 20 minutes from the modern town of Pylos, or 40 minutes from Kalamata. In the Mycenaean age of Greece, around 1600 to 1200 years before Christ, the Palace of Nestor controlled all of Messenia, a territory of about 2,000 square kilometers and a population of about 50,000 that was distributed among 200 settlements of various sizes. Several thousand people lived around the palace itself. A lord or king presided over the affairs of state, his throne in the central hall of the palace. He himself was a major landowner, and he hosted elaborate feasts and sacrifices to gods. He supported the manufacture of various products by free artisans and by slaves. His records were stored in archives, composed in a script called Linear B, the earliest script employed to write Greek, as we today know. As a result of archaeological investigations sponsored by my own University of Cincinnati since 1939, we know a remarkable amount about life in this extraordinary kingdom, although it came to end more than 3,000 years ago. Our evidence for diet comes from three sources. The first of these are more than 1,000 clay tablets that were accidentally baked in the inferno that destroyed the palace and inscribed in that Linear B script. We have no cookbook, but we learn much about the crops and animals grown and raised, consumed, and taxed by this early state. Grain crops were foremost, as is to be expected, both wheats and barleys. Sheep were herded in large numbers for wool as well as for food. We also have the evidence of physical remains to draw on. These include storage facilities for both wine and oil. Some of the palace's surplus of supplies were allocated as rations to workers. But my focus is on the menu developed under the influence of Crete, an haute cuisine served up by the elite and to the elite. Its introduction was marked by the rather sudden adoption of new types of cooking and drinking vessels, and along with them, presumably new styles of preparing and consuming food. First came the tripod cooking pot, which you see here illustrated on a wall painting showing a festival of the period. These were almost certainly used for stews. Next came griddles and souvlaki trays, given modern names by us for lack of any knowledge as to what they were actually called at the time. But it's a challenge to think of a function alternative to grilling meat. A style of dining at tables, seemingly indoors here, is depicted on wall paintings of the palatial throne room, and imbibing wine in cups replaced more communal rituals involving sharing wine from vessels of massive size earlier. Our excavations in Messenia on property belonging to the magnificent Costa Navarino resort yielded masses of pips from grapes on their way to becoming fully domesticated, the earliest such deposit yet found in Greece. But it is not merely the presence of the grape that matters. It's how wine made from the grapes was incorporated into dining behavior that matters. This type of dining must have been largely characteristic of feasts at festivals that were organized and sponsored by the king. We found the remains of meat distributions from one such festival, seemingly held in the honor of the god Poseidon. You see the remains here. The jaw and leg bones of 12 head of large cattle that had been burnt on an altar in the manner prescribed in later Greek texts. Such a sacrifice would have yielded sufficient meat for distribution to a couple thousand people. In addition to these physical remains, we have records on clay tablets that tell us the totality of food that was contributed to that god's festival. A tablet that we call UN 138, for instance, records that a man named Dunio contributed almost 2,000 liters of wheat, over 400 liters of olives, almost 400 liters of wine, 16 sheep, 13 goats, 12 pigs, a cow, 2 bulls, no partridge in a pear tree. We also know that spices such as coriander, cumin, cardamom, saffron, fennel, mint, and sesame were reaching palatial kitchens, some of these spices from the Near East. Not everybody ate with the elite, however, as we have discovered through stable isotope analysis of human remains, both from grander, which you see here, and more modest burials. Cereals contributed the greatest amount of carbohydrates to the diet. Legumes were the primary source of plant protein, with domesticates the major source of animal protein. The wealthier enjoyed a higher protein diet, a pattern that also is implied from our study of tooth decay. Oddly, fish constituted a very minor element in everyone's diet, while all women, wealthy or not, consumed less protein than men. This latter discovery may reflect women's more limited participation in feasting. At least that's one hypothesis. The party at the palace did not last forever. Not long after 1200 years before Christ, the palace of Nestor was totally destroyed in circumstances as yet unclear, but that were part of a general wave of catastrophes that brought an end to the Mycenaean civilization and others in the Eastern Mediterranean. That collapse was strongly marked by dramatic fall-offs in olive pollen deposition in lagoon settlements in western Messenia. Here you see the major lagoon in our area. The Mycenaeans had invested considerably in olive cultivation, but not only for its caloric significance in the diet, but also for its value in an industry dedicated to the production of perfumed oil. Oil from Messenia was being shipped abroad in specialized ceramic containers and must have been particularly sought after in places like Egypt, where less desirable oils such as castor oil were dominating markets. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm going to follow what Jack started about diet, but I'm going to talk about plants and what we can learn from plant remains from the past and how and if we can use them for a sustainable future. So, archaeobotany is the study of the past cultures by an examination of human populations' interactions with the plant world. So what humans do with plants. That's effectively what we're studying. And the plant remains retrieved from excavations around the world, and now we're focusing in Greece, provide first-hand information of the Mediterranean diet. So because it's site-specific, we know what we found at the Palace of Nestor, we know what we find in Crete, we know what we find in the Cyclades. So the roots of the Mediterranean diet, and we're looking back now, and we're going to what archaeology has told us, is a bread-making, plant-based food, olive oil, of course, wine, herbs, spices, nuts and fruits, and of course, the key of the Mediterranean diet that we see in prehistory, but we don't see it very much now, is the diversity of species. So how do these plant remains come to life? This is a very, very modest machine. We call it a flotation machine. It's effectively a barrel of oil, of petrol, really. And the plant remains are preserved charred. So they float. We have it full of water. They float. We collect them in sieves. And we bring the plant remains to life. Here, and then we look at them under the microscope. That's how what we look as archaeobotanists under the microscope are charcoal and plant remains that you can see. Very, very tiny black seeds that for most of us are very, very interesting. And now I'm going to just mention one of the sites of Messenia, not the Palace of Nestor, of course, which is the flagship of Messenia, but very close to it. The site of Iklena, dated at the 2nd millennium before Christ, has been excavated for many years by Professor Michael Kosmopoulos, and it's a peripheral Mycenaean center, it's not the heart of the palace. So there, and this was one of the pictures of the excavation. We do collect collect soil samples from everywhere at the excavation, and we try to reconstruct what the agricultural practices were. And here you can see my student, Simos Ginoudis, looking at plant remains, and there, from Iklena for his PhD thesis, and in this very, very nice box full of black seeds are olive remains from Iklena, and then this is with the suggestion that we have the presence of olive in Messenia since the second millennium before Christ. So we don't focus as archaeobotanists only in the fertile the fertile land of Messenia. We go in the center of the Aegean, at the site of Keros, third millennium before then the palace of Nestor, Jack, is one of the first urban centers in the Aegean, dated in the third millennium, excavated by the British School of Athens and the Ministry of Culture. Very famous for the figurines that we have found there, but we hope that it's going to be very famous for the plant remains that we find there as well. A lot of grapes, olives, almonds, coriander that we don't know where it comes from. And what we want to see there in this very, very highly dense occupied settlement, how these people survived and which ones were the resilient mechanisms that they had in the middle of the Aegean in the third millennium BC. As I said, it's not the fertile land of Messenia. So these are the plant remains that we know, and we have retrieved from excavations, 8 different cereals. We don't have that now in Greece. These are the legumes that we have found at the excavation, so they are scientifically confirmed. 8 different species of legumes. Again, we don't have that many in our Mediterranean diet today. And as I said in the beginning, that's the key of the Mediterranean diet, at least in the prehistory of Greece, the diversity of resources. They had to cultivate a lot of different species to survive. Now, we can find, of course, crushed olive remains that they're indicative of olive oil production. We have, as Jack mentioned, grape remains pressed that they actually show the action of a prehistoric man pressing grapes in Greece. And we do a lot of studies on a micro scale, and we can see what kind of varieties of olives and grapes we had in the past, and if we have affinities for these olive and grapes remains for these varieties that we have today. The other thing that we do as archaeobotanists, and we try to connect with the Mediterranean diet, is not that we don't actually only recover species. We recover the food waste of the Mediterranean in the sense that we can see dishes as well. So in the groundstone tools that people were grounding their cereals and pulses, we can see if they were grinding cereals or pulses, or if they were making type of bulgur or even flour. And then the culinary practices, these are fragmented lathyrus, grass pea remains from the site of Midea in Greece, in the Peloponnese, and this is effectively what we call fava today. So we can see not only, and I repeat myself, the species, but the dishes that the ancient people were making. And here are some of the dishes that, this is an actual dish, it's not like only cereals or pulses, or this is a very nice gentleman who's making bread. How can we see this in the archaeobotanical record? We can, with an excellent machine that is called scanning electron microscope, which is, you can see actually the microstructure of these remains, and we can reconstruct not the dishes that they had in their plates thousands of years ago. The other thing that I think, at least, that it's very important is that we bring the past to the future, or how I like to call it, because we revisit the record of tangible rural heritage, wine installations, olive installation, groundstone tools, what they were actually using in the 60s and the 50s in Greece. And we try to record and safeguard the living intangible heritage of older people, that if they die, this, or not if, when they die, this knowledge is going to be completely lost. So we go there, we go to farmers, older farmers, and we ask the right questions. I hope we ask the right ones about, say, food security and how these people reacted to crisis. And by crisis, it's climate, it's war, it's mobility when they leave their houses. And this is a very, very nice picture, and I hope that we have like 5 minutes to talk about in the discussion. It's in the middle of the Paphos area in Cyprus, where I live, and 800 meters. This is one of the very good examples of sustainable agriculture for wines. He doesn't do any chemicals. He doesn't use any water. He doesn't use any manure. So it's as close as a prehistoric farmer will actually farm its vineyards. And the Mediterranean diet today, well, we see that especially if you go around schools, you see a lot of young kids that their weight is not what possibly should be, and this is a key problem today. So, looking forward, what I hope that I made clear is that archaeology and archaeobotany, archaeozoology can provide information not to actually go to the past, but what we can learn from these people that survived for millennia, and they survived very, very successfully, and what can they inform us about. Thank you very much.
Γεια σας. Θα μιλήσω ελληνικά, παρότι το PowerPoint το έχω ετοιμάσει στα αγγλικά, νομίζω ότι είναι καλύτερα να το κάνουμε έτσι, οπότε ελπίζω ότι η μετάφραση θα είναι αρκετά καλή και γρήγορη για τους ομιλητές που δεν καταλαβαίνουν τα ελληνικά. Αυτό που θα ήθελα να μοιραστώ μαζί σας είναι λίγο μια άλλη πλευρά των δημόσιων πολιτικών, όχι μόνο των πολιτικών για την αγροτική παραγωγή και την κτηνοτροφική παραγωγή που είδαμε στην προηγούμενη ενότητα, των πολιτικών για τον πολιτισμό και πώς αυτές έχουν να κάνουν με ζητήματα της αγροδιατροφής. Να περάσουμε στο επόμενο, παρακαλώ. Εδώ είναι, ωραία. Αυτό που θα... Συγγνώμη. Ωραία, το πιάσα. Οι πολιτικές στο Υπουργείο Πολιτισμού που θα ήθελα να συζητήσουμε λίγο αφορούν την εφαρμογή της Σύμβασης για την διαφύλαξη της άειλης πολιτιστικής κληρονομιάς. Είναι μια από τις τελευταίες συμβάσεις της UNESCO, η σύμβαση αυτή, και η οποία έχει προκύψει μέσα από την ανάγκη να ξαναδούμε τι νόημα δίνουμε στον πολιτισμό και την κληρονομιά όταν δεν επικεντρωνόμαστε μόνο στα μνημεία, στα υλικά κατάλοιπα του παρελθόντος, αλλά συζητάμε για το τι δίνει νόημα στη ζωή των ανθρώπων, συζητάμε για τις πρακτικές τους, για τον τρόπο με τον οποίο οργανώνουν τη ζωή τους. Οπότε, σε αυτή την περίπτωση, αυτό που ενδιαφέρει κυρίως, αυτό που εξετάζουμε όταν συζητάμε για την άειλη πολιτιστική κληρονομιά, είναι κυρίως οι κοινότητες των ανθρώπων, πώς συγκροτούνται, τι τους δίνει νόημα και φυσικά όλο αυτό είναι επικεντρωμένο γύρω από το μεγάλο αίτημα του καιρού μας, την βιωσιμότητα, την αειφορία. Ακριβώς για να μπορέσουμε να κάνουμε αυτή τη δουλειά που θα σας περιγράψω, έχουν αναπτυχθεί μερικά εργαλεία διαφορετικά για την προσέγγιση αυτού του είδους της κληρονομιάς. Αυτό για το οποίο μιλάμε, το βλέπετε εδώ, είναι πρακτικές, αναπαραστάσεις, εκφράσεις, αλλά και εργαλεία και χώροι και ό,τι παράγεται από αυτά, τα οποία δίνουν νόημα, μάλλον δίνουν ταυτότητα στις κοινότητες των ανθρώπων οι οποίες τα επιτελούν. Το βασικό σε αυτή τη διαδικασία είναι τι νόημα έχει για τους ανθρώπους αυτό που κάνουν και αν αυτό που κάνουν θεωρούν ότι αποτελεί κομμάτι της ταυτότητάς τους, της κληρονομιάς τους. Εδώ μπορείτε να δείτε τους τομείς στους οποίους αυτές εκφράζονται. Στην Ελλάδα αυτούς τους τομείς τους ξέρετε πολύ καλά ως λαϊκό πολιτισμό, δεν χρειάζεται να επιμείνω. Χρησιμοποιούμε αυτή τη δύσκολη έννοια, την άειλη πολιτιστική κληρονομιά ή τη ζωντανή κληρονομιά, ακριβώς γιατί θέλουμε να μιλήσουμε για αυτές τις εκφράσεις σε ένα παγκόσμιο επίπεδο και όχι μόνο σε ένα ευρωπαϊκό, όπου περιγραφές όπως λαϊκός πολιτισμός ή πολιτισμός των πυροβιομηχανικών κοινότητων κλπ. Έχει νόημα. Σε ένα παγκόσμιο επίπεδο δεν έχει ακριβώς. Αυτό που έχει σημασία εδώ είναι ότι η αντιμετώπιση για την κληρονομιά ξεκινάει από μια διαφορετική βάση από την αντιμετώπιση που έχουμε για τη μνημειακή κληρονομιά. Τα μνημεία, τα κατάλοιπα του παρελθόντος, για τα οποία μας μιλούσαν πάρα πολύ ωραία η κυρία Μαργαρίτη και ο κύριος Ντέιβις, είναι ένας πόρος πεπερασμένος και σε κίνδυνο. Μόνο τόσα όσα μπορούμε να σώσουμε από το χώμα, μπορούμε να βγάλουμε από το χώμα. Αυτές οι πολιτισμικές εκφράσεις για τις οποίες μιλάμε, δηλαδή οι προφορικές παραδόσεις, ο χορός, οι τεχνογνωσίες κλπ, είναι ένας ανανεώσιμος πόρος. Θα είναι σε κίνδυνο μόνο αν ξεχαστεί. Είναι μια τελείως διαφορετική διαδικασία η μία και η άλλη και γι' αυτό απαιτεί τελείως διαφορετικές προσεγγίσεις. Στη μία προσέγγιση έχουμε να κάνουμε με αμυντικές πολιτικές για την πολιτιστική κληρονομιά, να σώσουμε ό,τι μπορούμε. Στην άλλη έχουμε να κάνουμε με πολιτικές οι οποίες βοηθούν τους ανθρώπους που αναγνωρίζουν σε κάποιες πρακτικές την πολιτιστική τους ταυτότητα να συνεχίσουν να την κάνουν. Είναι μια τελείως διαφορετική προσέγγιση. Στη μία περίπτωση μιλάμε για πολιτικές οι οποίες βασίζονται πάρα πολύ στην εξειδίκευση και στη γνώση των ειδικών. Στην άλλη περίπτωση μιλάμε για πολιτικές οι οποίες βάζουν μπροστά πρώτα και κύρια τη συνοχή της κοινότητας και τη βούλησή της να συνεχίσει να κάνει αυτές τις πρακτικές και βεβαίως τη βοήθεια που θα χρειαστούν από ειδικούς, γιατί ναι, τελικά οι ειδικοί χρειάζονται παντού και δεν μπορεί κανείς να κάνει χωρίς αυτούς. Ένα πολύ καλό παράδειγμα για το τι μιλάμε είναι η τελευταία εγγραφή που έκανε η χώρα μας στον αντιπροσωπευτικό κατάλογο της άειλης πολιτιστικής κληρονομιάς της ανθρωπότητας. Είναι το πανηγύρι της Μεσοσπορίτισσας στον αρχαιολογικό χώρο της Ελευσίνας. Η Ελευσίνα είναι ο χώρος στον οποίο λατρευόταν η αρχαία θεά της Γεωργίας, η Δήμητρα. Έχουμε έναν εντυπωσιακά ωραίο χώρο στην περιοχή αυτή, αρχαιολογικό χώρο, και μέσα σε αυτόν, σε ένα λοφάκι όπως βλέπετε, υπάρχει μια μικρή εκκλησία που γιορτάζουμε στις 21 Νοεμβρίου, τα εισόδια της Παναγίας. Η τελετή είναι πάρα πολύ εντυπωσιακή και συγκινητική, γιατί στον ίδιο χώρο όπου λατρευόταν μια γονιμική θεά, έχουμε μια γυναικεία θεϊκή μορφή, άγια μορφή, για τη λατρεία της οποίας οι πιστοί αφήνουν ακριβώς αυτά που ήταν τα σύμβολα της Δήμητρας. Τα πρόσφορα, το ψωμί, τον καρπό των Δημητριακών. Είναι ένα πολύ ωραίο, μια πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα τελετή που συμβαίνει στην Ελευσίνα και είναι κάτι το οποίο δεν ξέρουμε από πόσο παλιά μπορεί να κρατάει, είναι πολύ δύσκολο να το πούμε, όμως είναι η δύναμη της ζωντανής παράδοσης, η οποία σε μια περιοχή όπως η Ελευσίνα, η οποία έχει γνωρίσει, για όσους ξέρετε την Ελλάδα, μια πολύ άγρια βιομηχανική ανάπτυξη, με ναυπηγεία, με βιομηχανίες τσιμέντων κλπ. Είναι μια περιοχή δηλαδή η οποία μάζεψε, εκτός από τους παλιούς Ελευσινιώτες οι οποίοι έκαναν αυτή την τελετή, ανθρώπους από όλη την Ελλάδα. Υπάρχουν σύλλογοι Ποντίων, Υπηρετών, Πελοποννησίων, οι πάντες. Όλοι αυτοί έρχονται όμως εκεί, έχουν υιοθετήσει αυτό το έθιμο και ακόμα το έχουν υιοθετήσει και νεότεροι μετανάστες που έρχονται από την Ανατολική Ευρώπη και αλλού. Είναι μια τελετή που συμβαίνει στην Ελευσίνα σε ένα πολύ παλιό χώρο λατρευτικό και μαζεύει όλους τους σημερινούς κατοίκους της Ελευσίνας ακριβώς για την ευλογία της γης και για την καλοχρονιά όπως την καταλαβαίνουν σε αυτό το χώρο. Έχω ήδη ξεπεράσει πολλά από το χρόνο μου, το βλέπω. Θα ήθελα να πω ότι αυτή τη μεγάλη διαδικασία που έχουμε αρχίσει στο Υπουργείο Πολιτισμού για την ανάδειξη και τη διαφύλαξη ζωντανής παράδοσης την ξεκινήσαμε με την πρώτη εγγραφή στον αντιπροσωπευτικό κατάλογο της άειλης πολιτιστικής κληρονομιάς της ανθρωπότητας με τη μεσογειακή διατροφή. Μέχρι στιγμής έχουν εγγραφεί αυτές οι εκφράσεις που βλέπετε εδώ, 11 ή 12 αν δεν κάνω λάθος. Αυτό είναι, ας πούμε, αυτό που φαίνεται προς τα έξω, πολύ καθαρά. Θα περάσουμε και το τι κάνουμε από μέσα. Όμως ήδη σε αυτό βλέπετε μια μεγάλη έμφαση που δίνουμε σε παραδόσεις που έχουν να κάνουν με την αγροδιατροφική κληρονομιά και γενικά με την κληρονομιά γύρω από το φαγητό και την τροφή. Θα ήθελα να μείνω σε αυτό για λίγο, όσο αν έχω ένα μισό λεπτό ακόμα, ακριβώς πώς φτάνουμε σε αυτές τις εγγραφές στο Διεθνή Κατάλογο, ξεκινώντας από τις εγγραφές στο Εθνικό Ευρετήριο της Άειλης Πολιστικής Κληρονομιάς. Είναι μια δουλειά η οποία δεν τελειώνει, μπορείτε να τη βρείτε σε αυτή τη διεύθυνση. Έχουν εγγραφεί περίπου αυτή τη στιγμή 160 στοιχεία και από αυτά ένα πολύ μεγάλο τους κομμάτι είναι παραδόσεις που έχουν να κάνουν με την αγροδιατροφική κληρονομιά. Εδώ βλέπετε τις πρώτες από το 13 ως το 20 περίπου, αλλά εγγράφονται συνέχεια και είναι παραδόσεις οι οποίες έχουν πάρα πολύ μεγάλη σημασία για μας σήμερα. Γιατί αφενός αφορούν κοινότητες ανθρώπων και η εξάσκησή τους ενισχύει αυτές τις κοινότητες και αφετέρου έχουν μεγάλη σημασία για το πώς μπορούμε να διατηρήσουμε την αειφορία στη χώρα μας και γενικότερα ασκώντας βιώσιμες καλλιεργητικές πρακτικές. Γιατί όλες όσες εγγράφονται έρχονται από ένα βάθος χρόνου, από μια περίοδο όπου δεν είχαμε τα μέσα που έχουμε σήμερα στη γεωργική και κτηνοτροφική παραγωγή, άρα έχουν απαντήσεις για δύσκολα προβλήματα, για κρίσεις που συνάντησαν οι προηγούμενοι άνθρωποι και τις απάντησαν. Μέσα στον πυρήνα αυτών των γνώσεων υπάρχουν πάρα πολλές σημαντικές απαντήσεις που μας χρειάζονται σήμερα και θέλουμε την έμπνευση από αυτές. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
There we go. Yes, thank you very much, all of the panelists here. I think those were superb. We have a little time for questions. So I just want to begin posing one to them, and then if there's a couple from the audience, we'll take that. So what I'll ask anybody who wants to comment on it to do so. You know, we've heard fascinating observations from each of you about how the Mediterranean diet has evolved from its historical roots to what it is today. So my question was, how recognizable would what is commonly practiced today as the Mediterranean diet be to those practicing it a millennia ago? In particular, you know, notwithstanding advancements in food technologies, and even more particularly, how might culinary practices have evolved in that time? Would anybody like to comment?
I'll go first. I think that if somebody from the past would see the Mediterranean diet today and to recognize some of the ingredients would be olive oil, because from the moment that olive was domesticated, or even before, because they were gathering before, but from the moment that it was domesticated, and then you have a secondary product, so olive oil, it continues until today. We don't have a break. So that's one of the key elements that somebody would recognize from the past. And of course, cereals and pulses and fruits, they're the essence of that.
Okay, thank you.
Here, it's on, yes. I want to complement this, because again, just to take up what I was also trying to say before, the Mediterranean is just not one thing. Again, this is a term that was invented in 1975 in America. So we should remember this. I mean, you think about it, butter was also used in the Mediterranean. Northern Italy was butter. You look at Renaissance cookbooks, they're talking about the use of butter in the north. Until Artusi, Pellegrino Artusi, the cook and food writer in the 19th century, who basically, early 20th century, who united Italian cuisine. The upper classes in Italy were eating French food, aristocratic, French kind of inspired food with a lot of butter, a lot of meats, very rich, what we consider, again, unhealthy uses, of course, with spices to also show off wealth, as we know, spices from the East. So it's more complex than that, I think. We have to remember that people were eating all sorts of things according to also class. And I think this idea of what happened in Italy, for example, I live in Italy now, but Italy, especially in Tuscany where I live, but not only, the food that is considered the Mediterranean food, the Italian food, is historically cibo povero, right? Somebody mentioned that earlier today. Poor food, right? The peasant, what was so-called peasant food, which again was not necessarily liked by those who were condemned to have to eat it all the time. So it's more, I think it is more complicated. I mean, in a sense. That said, of course, all these ingredients we're talking about, it's fascinating to see the continuum is what we need to really, and to see all these old, these new wheats, these wheats that we were talking about before, these kinds of wheats are now being again, you know, I know that there's this attempt to really try to again plant them, again use them, because they are showing, I mean, for example, a lot of this pasta that people are eating, for example, not particularly healthy, from wheats that have been genetically engineered, that are causing gluten intolerance, probably. It'd be nice to hear from doctors about this here as well. This huge rise in gluten intolerance. Is it to do with the new kinds of wheats that are not particularly good for you anyway, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to actually cultivate these old varietals again. But that would be, I mean, there's so many aspects that are discontinuous, I think. I wanted to try to emphasize that.
Appreciate that. Anybody else? Or we?
Yeah, I'm on. Yeah. I think it's both fun and interesting and I'm glad Noga showed the maps of the entire Mediterranean, just to remind ourselves of how entangled the entire Mediterranean was from a very early time, and where the first populations came from who came into Greece, how agriculture initially was introduced from farther east. But those connections with the Near East, with what we call the Levant, never really were severed. They continued to be the case from the Neolithic in Greece, the New Stone Age, until effectively through modern times, with populations moving back and forth and intermingling, and along with those, the imports and the exports of goods. And all of those imports and exports, like the spices that I mentioned, all become incorporated into the diets of the various countries around the Mediterranean, sometimes in the same way, sometimes in different ways, and also through migrations. The other thing that I wanted to allude to is just how, and Evie said this too, but just how much effort was put into olive oil production during the Greek Bronze Age, and we ourselves were surprised at what went on in the second half of the second millennium BC, the enormous spike in olive cultivation that took place at least in Western Messenia at that time when we first engaged with the study of pollen, and through studying pollen that's settled into lagoons, we can trace the development of agricultural trends back thousands of years. And even that venture, like everything else that we do here, is very international. A lot of us know each other. We've had the same professors, we've studied in the same places, and then we've gone to different places. The first botanists to become involved in our area in studying the history of agriculture were the first Russians to come into Greece to work in recent times, since communist times, already in the 1990s. So this sense of internationality, both in antiquity and modern times, is so incredibly important to the reconstruction of past economies.
One last thing I would like to add, continuing from where Professor Davies left, I think a person 1,000 years ago would recognize the same place, the same difficult place. Greece is not an easy place to cultivate or to grow plants and husband animals. And he or she would recognize the effort, the toil of the people, and all the ways that people have devised for millennia to make use of this difficult, very mountainous land, the bond that they create, the people among themselves, in order to survive in this land. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
My mother was raised at a farm family in the American Midwest, never ceased to be amazed by how difficult farming was in Greece. I can recall when she first came here 50 years ago, she said, "Where's the soil?" She was totally flabbergasted.
We have time for a question or two. Please.
Thank you. Very fascinating presentation. Question directly, I think, to Evie and a couple of others. Are there tangible efforts to bring back those old wheats and legumes? And if so, how are you going to account for likely changes in the climate where you're going to try to compare to back then?
That's a very good question. I was, I mean, you mentioned it, Vika, Noga, about the different wheats and the species. Recently, I think 10 years ago or something, we had this spike about emmer wheat. That it's one of the founder domesticates around the world. And at some point, it ceased to be cultivated because we had the bread wheat, the ones that we make bread from, and it's much easier to cultivate. So these gloom wheats, as we call them, they cease to exist. And now we have this regeneration of emmer because it has much less gluten than the bread wheat. So that's a very key thing. Some farmers, especially in Italy, they have spelt wheat, another of the founder cereals that were domesticated. So we do have these regenerations, let's say. I went to Crete in the summer, and this is a very fancy restaurant, which I'm not going to mention the name because I don't want to promote them. And they're not in Messinia, so I'm not going to say it. They have a Lathyrus species, and it was a minor crop, a minor legume, and a minor pulse. And they have reinvented it, let's say, and everybody's going there to actually taste this fabulous legume, which was like, okay, right, but they do that, and it was in Crete, it was cultivated since the Minoan time, so it was part of their heritage. What we're trying to do, and that has started with colleagues in Israel. What they did, and it's not about the wheats, but it's from grape. They found it, and actually it's not prehistoric plant remains. It's Byzantine and or medieval, and they found grape remains. That's the one we showed. And because they found in a very, very dry area, they have extracted DNA, which is not the easiest thing to do, but they have done this. And now they're making varieties that they're drought resistant. That's something. And this is not something about the grape, the olive as well, because we're going towards the direction, that's a given. So that's how archaeology, I think, can contribute to this dialogue of how we're going to move forward.